The last thing I remember was the sweet smell of the pine air freshener hanging from my rearview mirror and my little daughter Maddie singing Twinkle, Twinkle in her car seat. Then, the world turned upside down. The brake pedal didn't just feel soft under my foot. It hit the floor with a sickening, hollow thud. It felt like the metal had been sliced clean through. As we barreled toward the busy intersection of 5th and Main, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pumped the brakes desperately, but there was nothing there, just empty space, and the terrifying realization that we weren't going to stop. I looked at the red light ahead and the heavy trucks crossing our path, and I knew in that split second that this was not a mechanical failure. This was an execution. I didn't have time to scream. I only had time to throw my arm back toward my daughter, trying to shield her from the inevitable. The sound of the wind rushing past the windows felt like a countdown. This was no accident. Someone had wanted me to reach this exact spot at this exact speed without any way to slow down. My name is Malia Veld. I am 32 years old, and until that morning, I thought I was living a perfectly safe and ordinary life. I am a landscape architect who spends most of my days drawing garden paths and choosing the right kind of shrubs for suburban backyards. I woke up 3 days after the crash in a cold, white ICU room with a shattered pelvis and a heavy fog in my brain. My body felt like it had been put through a meat grinder, and every breath was a battle against the sharp pain in my chest. As the monitors beeped rhythmically beside my bed, a jagged memory began to pierce through the darkness. I remembered a shadow. The night before the accident, I had looked out the kitchen window to grab a glass of water and saw a dark figure standing by my SUV in the driveway. At the time, I told myself it was just a neighbor's cat, or the wind playing tricks on my tired eyes. Now, lying broken in a hospital bed, I knew the shadow had been a person. They hadn't been admiring my car. They had been ending my life. Maddie survived. That was the only thing that kept me from sinking into total despair. She walked away with only a bruised shoulder and a few scratches, thanks to the heavy-duty car seat I had insisted on buying. When my husband brought her to visit me, she looked so small against the giant hospital equipment. She climbed onto the edge of the bed, her eyes wide with a secret she didn't know how to carry. She leaned in close and whispered, "Mommy, why did Uncle Rodney touch the wheels of the car last night?" My heart didn't just skip a beat. It stopped entirely. My brother, Rodney, was the one who had come over for dinner that night. He was the one who had been so insistent that I take the scenic route through the valley that morning because the main highway was under construction. He had hugged me goodbye with a smile that I now realized was a mask. A cold shiver ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My own brother had stood in my driveway and messed with my brakes while I was inside tucking his niece into bed. The morning of the crash had started so normally. It was one of those beautiful Connecticut mornings where the sunlight filters through the trees in golden strips. I had just landed a massive $200,000 contract to design a new city park, the biggest achievement of my career. I was beaming with pride as I packed Maddie's lunch and grabbed my keys. Rodney had even called me at 7 a.m. to congratulate me again, reminding me to take the back roads to avoid the morning traffic. Everything felt right. Everything felt earned. Looking back now, that normality is the most terrifying part of the whole ordeal. It was the perfect camouflage for a monster. We ate pancakes, I checked my email, and I kissed my husband goodbye. There was no sign of danger, no bad omen in the sky. I walked right into the trap with a smile on my face, never imagining that the person who shared my childhood home was currently waiting for the news of my death. The contrast between that peaceful breakfast and the chaos that followed is something I still can't wrap my head around. The crash itself felt like a cinematic nightmare. First came the screech of metal, a sound so high and piercing it felt like it was splitting my skull. Then came the sensory overload, the smell of burning rubber, the sight of a blue sedan swerving wildly to miss us, and the frantic grip of my hands on a steering wheel that no longer had any power. I remember the sickening, heavy thud as the front of my SUV slammed into the concrete barrier. The glass didn't just break, It shattered into millions of tiny diamonds that seemed to float in the air in slow motion. I felt the airbag explode against my face like a punch from a giant. Through the smoke and the dust, all I could hear was Maddie's high-pitched sobbing from the back. I tried to reach for her, but my legs wouldn't move. My vision started to blur at the edges, turning the world into a tunnel of gray and red. I didn't scream for myself as the darkness closed in. I only whispered her name, hoping the universe would be kinder to her than it was being to me. The doctors called me a walking miracle, though I wasn't doing much walking. I had 5 major surgeries in the first week. They put a long titanium rod in my leg and stitched up my internal injuries. While the physical pain was an 11 on a scale of 10, the mental puzzle was what truly kept me awake at night. The police had come by to hand me a plastic bag filled with my belongings from the wreckage. My phone was cracked, my wallet was singed, but one thing was missing. I had a high-end dash cam that recorded everything, even when the car was parked. I asked the officer about the memory card, but he shook his head. He said the slot was empty when they recovered the camera. That was the moment I knew for certain that this was a professional job. Someone hadn't just caused the crash. They had arrived at the scene or gone to the impound lot to remove the evidence. I was no longer just a victim of a crime. I was the target of a cover-up that went deeper than I could imagine. My husband, Julian, was the image of the perfect partner. He was a rock during those first few weeks of agony. He never left my side, choosing to sleep in the cramped, uncomfortable hospital chair rather than go home to a warm bed. He handled every phone call from the insurance adjusters. He made sure Maddie got to school on time, and he brought me my favorite home-cooked meals because he knew I hated hospital food. When I finally took my first wobbling steps with a walker, Julian cried. He held my waist and told me how brave I was. Every nurse on the floor told me the same thing. Malia, you hit the jackpot with that man. Most husbands would have folded under this much pressure. I believed them. I leaned into him, letting him carry the weight of our lives while I tried to knit my bones back together. He was my protector, my best friend, and the only person I trusted completely in a world that had suddenly become very dark and very dangerous. The first crack in the perfect world happened when my sister-in-law Melanie came to visit. She was Rodney's wife, a woman who always seemed more interested in her reflection than in other people. She walked into my room wearing a designer coat that probably cost more than my first car. She didn't look at my bandages or ask about my pain levels. Instead, her eyes went straight to my bedside table where my jewelry box sat. "It's just so tragic about the SUV, Malia," she said, her voice sounding forced and thin. "But I suppose the silver lining is the life insurance policy your firm carries. It's substantial, isn't it? A few million for a partner?" I felt a wave of ice-cold water pour down my spine. I had never told Melanie or Rodney about my firm's private insurance policy. That was confidential information, meant only for partners and their spouses. How did she know the exact details? I watched her adjust her expensive sleeve and realized that my family wasn't mourning my accident. They were counting the days until it became a payout. 2 weeks into my recovery, a detective named Miller visited me with the official police report. He sat down and sighed, looking at me with pity. "The lab results are in, Malia. Your brake lines were tampered with. They were partially cut so they would hold for a few miles and then snap under high pressure." My heart hammered. But then he added the twist that changed everything. "We found a GPS tracker hidden under your rear bumper. We traced the serial number." My breath hitched. I expected him to say it was a random stalker. Instead, he said, "The tracker was purchased by a dummy corporation called Veld Heritage Holdings." "Does that name mean anything to you?" I felt like I had been hit by the car all over again. Veld Heritage Holdings was the name of my family's private estate fund, a fund managed by my brother, Rodney, and overseen by my mother. This wasn't just a crime, it was a family business. I was being tracked like a piece of prey by the people I had spent every Christmas with. I was still processing the news about the tracker when Rodney came to visit that evening. He looked tired, clutching a bouquet of lilies that smelled like a funeral. He sat on the edge of my bed and grabbed my hand, his palms sweaty against mine. "Malia, I have to tell you something, and it's going to hurt. he whispered, glancing at the door. I saw Julian in the garage the night before the crash. He was acting strange, hiding something under a rag. My blood ran cold, but for a different reason than he intended. He leaned in closer, his voice dripping with fake concern. Julian is in deep gambling debt, sis. I think he did it for the insurance money. I didn't want to believe it, but I had to tell you. I stared at my brother, the man I had grown up with, and felt a surge of pure, hot outrage. He was trying to frame my husband. He was trying to isolate me from the only person who was actually helping me. It was a masterstroke of villainy. Make me fear the man sleeping in the chair next to me. The next few hours were an emotional blur of chaos. Against my better judgment, the seed of doubt Rodney planted began to itch. When Julian came in later that night, I didn't greet him with a smile. I looked at him and asked, "Are you in debt, Julian? Tell me the truth." Julian didn't get angry. He didn't get defensive. He looked at me with such profound sadness that I felt my heart break. He sat down and pulled up his banking app on his phone, showing me every single transaction from the last year. He wasn't in debt. In fact, he had been moving money into a secret savings account. "I was saving up to surprise you with that greenhouse you always wanted for your birthday," he choked out, his voice thick with tears. Just as I reached out to apologize, the door burst open. 2 police officers entered. They had a search warrant. 10 minutes later, they found a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters in our kitchen trash can, cutters coated in the same hydraulic fluid from my car. They had Julian's fingerprints on the handles. They took Julian away in handcuffs. I screamed for them to stop, but my broken body kept me pinned to the bed. My family rushed in like vultures the moment he was gone. My mother and Rodney stood by my side, telling me that I had to let him go and focus on my health. They told me they would handle the lawyers and the house. But as I watched Rodney's smug reflection in the window, I realized I was the only person who knew the truth. Julian didn't know how to use wire cutters, and he certainly wouldn't have left them in our own trash can. It was too sloppy, too perfectly framed. I realized that if I didn't fight back now, I would be the next person to accidentally fall down the stairs or have a reaction to my medication. I was living in a den of snakes, and they had just removed my only protector. I made a silent vow right then. I was no longer a victim. I was a fighter. If no one else was going to find the truth, I would. I started my own investigation from my hospital bed using my laptop and phone. I didn't call a lawyer yet. I needed proof that wouldn't be dismissed as family drama. I remembered my dash cam. Even though the memory card was stolen, I had set up a secondary cloud backup months ago that I had completely forgotten about. It was a cheap service that only synced when the car was near our home Wi-Fi. I logged into the account, my fingers trembling as I typed the password. The screen showed a spinning wheel for what felt like hours. Then the files appeared. There was a recording from 2 a.m. the night before the crash. The camera was facing the interior of the garage. I saw a woman's silhouette moving near the front of the car. She was wearing a very specific, limited edition designer coat with a fur collar, the same one Melanie had worn to the hospital. But she wasn't alone. As she stepped aside, a man stepped into the light to hold a flashlight for her. It was Rodney. Seeing the footage was like being hit by a second emotional nuke. My own brother hadn't just watched. He had been the one holding the light while his wife helped him destroy my life. The betrayal felt physical, a sharp pain in my gut that no surgery could fix. I zoomed in on Rodney's face. He didn't look guilty. He looked focused, like he was working on a DIY project. He was checking the lines, making sure the setup was perfect. This was the man who had walked me down the hall when I graduated. This was the man who had held Maddie at her christening. I realized then that there is no limit to what greed can do to a person's soul. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted me to suffer while they profited. The ultimate betrayal wasn't the broken brakes. It was the fact that they were willing to kill a 4-year-old girl just to get to my bank account. I sat in the dark room, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my eyes, and felt a coldness settle over me that would never leave. The motivation was simple, universal, and disgusting: greed. I spent the next day digging through old family records and digital files. I discovered that our grandmother had left a massive 30-acre plot of coastal land in Maine to only me. She had changed her will 3 years ago because she knew about Rodney's secret gambling addiction and my mother's habit of bailing him out with family funds. The land was worth nearly $5 million due to new development in the area. According to the Veld family trust documents, if I died, the land wouldn't go to Julian. It would bypass him and go straight to the next blood relative, Rodney. He didn't want a scare. He didn't want a lesson. He wanted the land, and I was the only thing standing in the way of his payday. He had used Melanie to help him because he knew she wanted the lifestyle that money would provide. It was a realistic, dirty motive that made my stomach turn. They were willing to trade my life for a piece of dirt by the ocean. I didn't call Rodney to scream at him. I didn't tell my mother I knew. Instead, I called a high-powered private investigator and a lawyer who specialized in white-collar crime. We set a trap. I called Rodney and told him I was feeling overwhelmed and was considering selling the Maine land to pay for Julian's legal defense. I told him I needed him to come over to the hospital to sign some preliminary papers as a witness. He arrived within the hour, looking eager and helpful. I watched his face as I handed him the folder. His eyes lit up with a hunger that was almost animalistic. "You're doing the right thing, Malia," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Julian is a lost cause. You need to protect yourself." While he talked, my investigator was in the parking lot, filming Rodney's car, the same car that had been seen near the impound lot the day my dashcam card went missing. We were gathering the puzzle pieces, one by one, until the picture was undeniable. The emotional aftermath of that meeting left me shaking. Every "I love you" Rodney had said over the last decade felt like a poisoned dart. I realized I had been living a lie for years. I had supported him, lent him money, and defended him when others said he was untrustworthy. I had almost let an innocent man, my husband, the father of my child, rot in a jail cell because I couldn't imagine my brother being a monster. The truth left a scar on my heart that I knew would never fully heal. I looked at the photos of us as kids on my nightstand and felt like I was looking at strangers. But that pain turned into a quiet, cold strength. I wasn't just doing this for revenge, I was doing it for justice. I was doing it to make sure Maddie grew up in a world where the people who claimed to love her actually did. The accident was over, but the war had just begun. I checked the clock. It was time to pull the trigger on the plan. I thought I had reached the bottom of the pit, but there was another level of betrayal I hadn't seen. While my investigator was hacking into Rodney's emails, he found a hidden, encrypted folder on a shared family server. It wasn't Rodney's. It was my mother's. I opened it and found a series of messages between her and Rodney dating back 6 months. She hadn't just known about the plan. She had been the one to suggest the timing. She told Rodney that the insurance payout from my firm would be the only way to save the family estate from foreclosure. "Malia is strong," she had written. "She'll survive a little scare, and we'll get the funds we need. It's for the greater good of the Veld name." I felt a second crash inside my chest. My mother, the woman who raised me, saw my life as a financial transaction. She wasn't worried about my broken bones. She was worried about the reputation of a family name that was already rotting from the inside out. The stakes hit a new high when my mother showed up at the hospital that evening. She didn't bring flowers this time. She sat down and looked me straight in the eye with a cold, hard expression I had never seen before. "I know you've been talking to an investigator, Malia," she said, her voice dropping to a low hiss. "Stop this now. If you take Rodney down, you destroy this family's standing in this town. You'll be the one who sent her own brother to prison. Is that land worth your mother's heart? Think about Maddie. Do you want her to grow up with a family in ruins?" It was the ultimate emotional blackmail. She was trying to use my love for my daughter and my sense of duty to keep me silent. She was protecting the predator instead of the victim. For a second, I felt the old Malia, wanting to apologize and keep the peace. But then I remembered the feeling of the brake pedal hitting the floor. I remembered Maddie's screams. I didn't back down. I pulled my phone out from under my pillow. It was already recording. "Tell me, Mom," I said, my voice steady. "Did you know Rodney was going to cut the lines that night? Or did you just tell him to make it happen? She scoffed, thinking she was still in control. It was just supposed to be a small scare, Malia. You weren't supposed to actually hit the barrier at that speed. Rodney said he'd handle the timing. We just needed you incapacitated so he could take over the power of attorney and sign the land over. I had it. Every word. The confession was clear, cold, and final. She didn't even look guilty. She looked annoyed that the plan hadn't gone smoother. I felt a wave of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. I didn't need to wonder anymore. I didn't need to feel bad. They had confessed to trying to incapacitate me for money. They had turned my life into a chess game, and I had just put them in checkmate. Mark? No, Rodney. Tried to come into the room just then. He saw the look on my face and realized something was wrong. He tried to grab my phone, his face twisting into a mask of rage. Give me that, you ungrateful brat, he shouted. I thought I was trapped, unable to run with my broken pelvis. But then, the door swung open. Julian walked in. He had been released an hour early because the evidence against him had been flagged as tampered by an anonymous tip from my investigator. The look of pure terror on Rodney's face when he saw Julian, the man he had tried to frame, standing there, was the most satisfying moment of my entire life. Julian didn't say a word. He just stepped between me and Rodney, his shoulders broad and his eyes full of fire. Rodney backed away, stumbling over a chair. The perfect brother was gone, replaced by a coward who knew his time was up. The police were right behind Julian, led by Detective Miller. The legal chess move was the final blow. I didn't just let the police handle the criminal side. My lawyer filed a massive civil suit that froze every single asset Rodney and my mother owned. We used a legal concept called the Slayer Rule. Even though I wasn't dead, the intent to harm for financial gain meant they could no longer inherit or benefit from any part of the Veld estate or my grandmother's land. I watched from my hospital window as Rodney was led away in zip ties, his expensive suit rumpled and his head hanging low. The news cameras were there, capturing the perfect son as he was charged with attempted murder and conspiracy. Melanie was arrested an hour later at a hair salon. She was charged as an accessory for her role in the tampering and the theft of the memory card. My mother wasn't arrested that day, but she was ruined. Every bridge she had built in our social circle was burned. She was left with nothing but the reputation she had tried so hard to protect, and now it was stained forever. The downfall was spectacular and swift. Rodney couldn't afford the high-priced lawyers he thought he'd have, and his friends disappeared the moment the charges were read. He ended up taking a plea deal that sent him to prison for 15 years. Melanie received 5 years for her role. My mother was forced to sell the family estate to pay for the legal fees and the civil settlements I won against them. I didn't keep a dime of that money for myself. I used it to set up a trust for Maddie and to fund a center for survivors of domestic and familial betrayal. The most significant emotional payoff, however, came 3 months later. I stood on the edge of that coastal land in Maine, no longer using a cane. I watched the sunrise over the Atlantic and felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. I was no longer the girl who had to please her mother or protect her brother. I was just Malia, and I was free. I didn't sell the land to developers. Instead, I worked with my firm to design a beautiful, sustainable park and sanctuary on the property. It became a place where people could come to find peace, just like I had. I stood on the cliffside with Julian and Maddie, watching her run through the tall grass. I realized that the setup didn't break me. It purged the poison from my life. It was a violent, terrifying way to find out who my family really was. But I would rather know the truth and be broken than live a lie and be whole. My body still ached when it rained, and I still had nightmares about the sound of crashing metal. But my heart was light. I had protected my daughter, cleared my husband's name, and built something beautiful out of the wreckage of my old life. The Veld name didn't belong to Rodney or my mother anymore. It belonged to me, and I was going to make sure it stood for something good. Julian and I moved into a small, sun-drenched house near the park. We don't talk about Rodney or my mother much anymore. Rodney sent me a letter from prison last week, filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. I didn't even open it. I walked out to the small campfire we had built on the beach and watched the paper turn to ash. Some things are meant to burn so that better things can grow in their place. I realized that the accident was the moment my real life began. It taught me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about having the courage to look at the person who pushed you and tell them they missed. My car crash wasn't an accident. It was a setup that was meant to end me, but instead, it started me. As I walked back to my house, where my husband was cooking dinner and my daughter was laughing, I knew I had won. I am Malia Veld, and I am a survivor. The truth might leave a scar, but a scar is just proof that you healed. If you like this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this family.